Thanks a lot for staying with us. Now, violent protests that have shaken France in response to the killing of a 17-year-old by the hands of the police officer have entered the sixth day. Hundreds of more arrests have been made amid nationwide protests that have turned into blatant rioting. This comes after protesters have torched thousands of cars, vandalized both public and private infrastructure, and have clashed with the police. Protesters have also attacked the house of mayor of a Paris suburb yesterday, injuring his wife and young child. French President Emmanuel Macron postponed a state visit to Germany that was to begin on Sunday due to this unrest. Meanwhile, Nahel's grandmother, while giving an interview to the French channel, this is the boy who was killed by the police officer, has pleaded rioters to stop after 5 nights of unrest. Now, the issue is that violent French protests have also reached neighbouring countries in Belgium and Switzerland. Crashes broke out with officers as people in the Swiss city of Lausanne held a demonstration at the weekend. Cops had to resort to Molotov cocktails as protesters allegedly threw bricks and smashed windows. Protesters also clashed with police in Brussels on Thursday, where police arrested 64 people. The rioters were seen chanting justice for Nahel in the Belgian capital as well. The big issue that we're debating is that this is not the first time that any of these countries are really seeing these intercultural rioting or clashes. And the big fundamental question that arises is multiculturalism that Europe countries had fought for and were known for failing in the continent. Let's go across to our guest joining us. Sushant Sareen is Senior Fellow, ORF. David Shazan is a journalist joining us live from Paris. David, can I begin by getting your sense of how it is in Paris and overall in France?
Well, we've had 6 nights of rioting and we've seen some awful scenes in Paris, Marseille and other towns and cities all the way across the country. But last night, things were relatively quiet. There were fewer clashes, a lot less violence and vandalism, certainly less looting. So we are getting a sense now that things are beginning to calm down and that the authorities are getting a grip on it. They've deployed 45,000 police officers across the country to deal with this. So it's really serious. As you were saying, President Macron had to cancel a state visit. And there's a sense that trying to quell the rage on the streets is gobbling up all of the president's attention to the point where nothing much else is being dealt with at the moment. But nevertheless, tentative optimism that things are beginning to calm down.
Before I go to Sushant, can I also understand from you, David, while it's always been a little bit of a problem, the assimilation of the immigrant population, especially the refugee population that countries like France and others took in, do you believe that socially this is becoming a big issue, that there are now more and more people who are willing to say that this did not work for us?
I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's been a big issue for decades. I covered a previous set of riots, which lasted for 3 weeks, 18 years ago. And the things I heard from people in the gritty suburbs where there are rows and rows of tower blocks, you know, sort of fairly low quality public housing, apartment blocks where the lifts often don't work, poorly maintained. People who live in these areas complain of poor public services. Young people say they face discrimination when they apply for jobs. Schools in these areas are not necessarily as good as they are in other areas. And young people say they're far more likely than white people to be stopped and searched by the police. And when they do have an interaction with the police, they're far more likely to face police violence or brutality. Now, I think these grievances are justified. I think France really needs to take a good, hard look at how it deals with ethnic issues. But I'm not sure that the government's always willing to listen to complaints like this, because we've been hearing from UN human rights officials that they believe there's a systemic issue of racism and discrimination in policing in France. Now, the government's reacted angrily. It says, no, there's no systemic racism. So what do? I mean, if you want to solve a problem, you have to acknowledge first that there is a problem.
Okay. Sushant, the other, of course, the flip side to that is that there are people who for many, many years and possibly many decades, as David is saying, have been talking about how there is a lack of assimilation, let's say, amongst the African Muslim migrants that have come to a lot of these European countries. And there seems to be some sizable anger building up for this whole open border policy. Do you believe that it is political correctness that is keeping politicians and others from really talking about how this has not worked, this experiment has failed?
Well, no, I don't think it is really, because
David, just sorry to interrupt you. That question is for Sushant. Yes, Sushant, go ahead.
Yeah, Shivani, clearly that experiment has not succeeded, and we are seeing the effects of the failures of that particular experiment. You can call it by whatever name you want to call it: multiculturalism, assimilation, or whatever other term you want to coin for it. It hasn't succeeded, at least in the whole of Europe, because France might be a particularly bad case of what's happening, but I don't think any of the other Western European countries are any better off. Now, I agree with what David was saying, that you have to first acknowledge that there's a problem. The question is, what exactly is the problem? Have you been able to identify the problem as a whole, or are you only looking at one side of the problem and not the other side of the problem? Now, clearly, what has been happening over the last couple of days is indicative of a social, political, and economic, and administrative, and most of all, an intellectual failure in many of these countries. Okay, you might not have seen the same kind of violence in Britain, but some of the scenes which you see happening in Britain of street violence, number one, number two, of these guys marching and making blood-curdling calls, threatening Jews, threatening Hindus. You never expected that to happen in Britain. And there
are allegedly no-go areas as well. There are no-go areas developing in a lot of these countries. And then how can you complain about police not giving you enough protection? Exactly.
And Shivani, the problem then is that a kind of a license is given with political correctness. Now, for example, just today or yesterday or today, I remember reading in, the Guardian, which is supposed to be this flag bearer of liberal politics, is actually justifying the rioting, the burning, the arson in France. And they are saying this is, consider this to be reparations for colonialism. Now, okay, colonialism was a very nasty side of history. But are you then saying that, okay, fine, we are going to take revenge for that? Is that the argument? We've seen similar arguments in the United States, where one of the CNN anchors had asked this question. Where is it written that protests have to be always peaceful, that they can't be violent? This is when that entire Black Lives rioting was taking place. Right. Black Lives Matter rioting.
So you're saying that
you had these kind of people offer justification, and frankly, this is really problematic and troublesome. And this is not now limiting itself to France.
Yeah, I was going to come to exactly that question. Now, the question that does...
Montreal, for example.
The question that arises is that, one, is there license to riot that is given to a certain section? Because as Sushant was pointing out, now Indians have been ruled by colonial British masters. Will it be okay for the Indian community to riot in Britain? And will they also get the sanction in the name of colonialism? I really doubt that. But in any case, David, the question I also wanted to ask you was, now people are questioning, okay, this happened in France, but why are these riots spilling in Belgium, in Switzerland? And is rioting the answer to the justice that is being demanded for?
Well, remember, France has borders with both Belgium and Switzerland, and the areas of those countries where there has been trouble, it's only been fairly limited, to be honest, but those areas are French-speaking. So they're kind of culturally connected to France. They know about what's going on in France. And I think the minority communities in those areas, particularly people of Arab, Muslim, African descent, feel much as many of the young people here in France do, that they're not getting a fair crack of they're not getting fair opportunities, because even if they're third or fourth generation immigrants, they say France, or probably Switzerland and Belgium too, doesn't fully accept them as being French. And these are people who are really more culturally French than anything else.
But is it not true, David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I take your point that, yes, there must be some institutional differences or perceived differences, even if not legal differences, that make people feel alienated. But is it not true, and I want to ask you that Nahel, this young boy in question, had a record?
He had been stopped driving a car several times. Now, he was 17 years old. This is a country where you cannot get a driving license until you're 18.
Yeah.
So was he a boy who disobeyed the rules? It looks like he probably was.
Okay.
And I don't think he'd been punished particularly harshly. So I think what you're getting at, you were talking about no-go areas. There are areas in the deprived neighborhoods of France that are very difficult for police to operate in, because youth unemployment is extremely high as 40% in some areas, and the drug gangs operate very heavily in these districts.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. So, David, I'll just stop you short there so that I can give 30 seconds to Sushant, who wanted to come in. But that brings me to a fundamental question itself. You took in a lot of people, but you didn't have space for them, whether it's creating enough opportunities for them or assimilation for them. And that's the fundamental question. Then did that policy of taking people in without considering whether they'll be fully, they'll get all the opportunities, is whether this has failed. But Sushant, I have 30 seconds only, please, your final thoughts.
Yeah, Shivani, very quickly, I don't think that it's simply a matter that you've taken in enough people and you can't cater for them. I think the problem is, look at the Indian community. It's as if racism does not affect Indians. But the Indians, whether in Britain or in any other part of Europe, have gone out there. They have faced up to the racism, they have faced up to the discrimination,
yes.
They have faced up to everything which has been thrown at the others. And yet, by sheer dint of hard work, by sheer, perseverance, they've have raised
the ranks. Okay, I'm sorry, Sushant, I've run out of time. Sorry, I'm run out of time. We will try to look into this issue in deeper concern later as well. Time for me to take your leave. My colleague Anand is joining.